Hi everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we finally finish the close reading of Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. After 28 weeks, we finally get to the end, the last video that covers the fragments on philosophy, this time from the last chapter of Notes and Sketches. So for a reminder, this last chapter was about sketching a theory of fascism, like how we get to fascism. And we said that it starts with a certain relationship between man and animal, a relationship based on domination, and how from this domination we get to stupidity. And then from stupidity we said that we get isolation, and this isolation is fueled by propaganda and the media. Stupidity is basically a lack of critical thinking, and the media, well, they want that. They seek to impede people's ability for thinking, and we've seen that thinking became to be viewed by the standards of enlightenment as a superstition, like thought was banished by progress. And if it sounds a little bit counterintuitive to you, well, check the videos I made on the first chapter, the concept of enlightenment, to understand what is meant by progress/enlightenment. They view thought as a superstition. And so then we talked about how fascism is going to normalize terror and direct violence. The idea behind progress is to get things done directly, while it means eliminating all forms of mediation. And so thought was the ultimate form of mediation, as it slows down all kinds of immediate responses in order to create the time to, well, think. But direct and immediate reactions are always they're always violent, according to Adorno and Horkheimer. Terror is when people are exposed to immediacy, when they have nothing to protect them, and so progress turns out to be a return to the state of nature where everyone is left to fend for themselves, where basically might makes right. So the last video on the book will be about the recovery of thought. It's going to be about the role of philosophy, and so the main thesis is that, philosophy should not be about progress, and so it needs to be a challenge. It needs to challenge progress, and so the first thing that it needs to challenge is how enlightenment looked at history. So history is seen as progress from the point of view of enlightenment, and that's where our analysis begins. So the ideas of philosophers such as Hegel regarding progress imply a philosophy of history. Like we already explained, for Hegelian philosophers, history moves in stages towards a perfecting of itself. Each stage is a bettering of a previous stage. But this bettering is brought about by necessity. It is by necessity, for example, that the child becomes the adult, and so it is also by necessity, according to Hegel, that natural religion become Christianity. And what this means is that what we have today is never an accident, including human beings. Human beings are a necessity over animals. Like Darwinian evolution is taken up by some teleologians, meaning people who believe that there is a final purpose for all kinds of evolution. It comes from the Greek word telos, which means purpose. And they argue that when human beings have evolved from, our common ancestor with apes, it is because we had to evolve into human beings. And what this suggests is that human beings are not a freak event in natural history. A freak event means that something happens by chance or accident. When we look at the animal kingdom, for example, despite seeing many differences and specificities between animals, human beings, they stand out way too radically. What human beings are capable of doing and what they did, no other species of animals were able to produce, or at least produce something equivalent. So it makes human beings seem as an exception, as a bug in the system, as a freak of nature. But we don't want to be freaks, not because it's demeaning, but because being a freak means something that we cannot really explain, and this pisses off modern people. To say that there is something we cannot explain really bothers us. So we often try to provide an explanation for it. Sometimes it is theological, like it's because God loves us and He made us in His image, so it's not random. Or it's because there is a certain necessity that pushes us towards that direction, some sort of teleology. So in short, the freak event theory cannot be true. Now, to be clear, Adorno and Horkheimer, they're not saying otherwise. They're not defending the freak event theory. For them, there is a necessity for why human beings are the way that they are, but they reject the idea that this necessity means that we are better. They reject the idea of necessary progress, like something pushes us into evolving, but not because there is a final goal towards which we are going. From the opening of the note, they say, the human species is not, as has been asserted, a freak event in natural history, an incidental and abnormal formation produced by hypertrophy of the cerebral organ. So, yeah, they agree that we are not an incidental and abnormal formation, even if that assertion is true, and they contend that it can be. There are always exceptions. There are always individuals or some countries, for example, in short periods of time that stand out, like, for example, a genius. But even those exceptions only get to the exceptions because of the economic conditions of their time and place. Individuals manage to stand out because there are pre-existing structures that would allow them to stand out. If you are a genius in basketball, for example, but there are no basketball hoops, you're not going to go down as a great basketball athlete in history. So we are grounded in the idea that there is some necessity into becoming who we are. Evolution implies that we are the product of a certain history, just like, you know, the bear's teeth imply that it is a product of its environment, and so likewise our brains, the machines that we use, etc. All of those things, they imply that we are the product of our environment and our history. Like animals, we too adapt to our environment and historical periods. As they say, in this epoch, the human species, including its machines, chemicals, and organizational power, for why should they not be seen as a part of it, as teeth are a part of the bear, since they serve the same purpose and merely function better, is the last word in adaptation. And they also contend that you can make the case that, relatively to other animals, we have adapted in the most efficient way. With what our brains produced, we are able to dominate nature and the predators that we were scared of. But this is very different from saying what Hegelians and teleologians are saying about human beings. Hegelianism uses progress in order to justify why some individuals, for example, are better than others. Hegel believed that history's progress was the doing of special people, those, you know, geniuses mentioned earlier. And so these individuals for Hegel are always eccentric, they are different from the rest, because according to him they embody the next stage of concepts. The progress towards freedom and justice is done because those concepts take flesh in some great individuals. They are incarnated in those individuals who bring about progress. And so this is what Hegel thought of Napoleon, for example, that he was the soul of the world incarnated. And so these figures in Hegelian history bring about the inventions, the political changes that we see, and therefore this gives them legitimacy to rule over others. They are insignificant in relation to the course of history, of course. For Hegel, these figures are just instances of a long process, but they are still superior to others because they brought history closer to its final purpose. And so this final purpose is, of course, determined by the principle of self-preservation. Humanity is approaching its peak because it gets the tools to better reproduce itself and therefore to dominate nature. What reaches perfection is what is able to keep reproducing, to keep repeating itself indefinitely. And so the conclusion from all of this is that all ideas, prohibitions, religions, and political creeds are of interest only insofar as, arising from diverse conditions, they increase or decrease the natural survival prospects of the human species on the earth or within the universe. So the reason why liberalism, for example, liberated people from the oppression of the feudal lords wasn't to emancipate them, but to unleash machinery with which human beings can control nature with more ease and therefore increase their chances of survival and of self-preservation. And so in a similar way, Adorno and Horkheimer, they note how the emancipation of women was done so that women too can become another tool for domination. The emancipation of women from the 20s and the 40s was so that they too can be trained for military purposes. So we liberate so that we can better exploit, so that we can progress. And so our relationship with animals is no different. Medicine, they argue, progressed out of the inhumane treatment we make animals undergo. Freedom and progress thrives, they thrive on defenseless creatures, as they say. So to liberate women and peasants means to turn them into lab animals, into a labor force to be exploited for profit. progress. Everything that is progressive is produced at the expense of something else, something deemed less valuable or inferior to the desired state of progress. And so civilization itself is based on the idea that it is only achievable at the expense of nature, whether nature within human society or outside society. And so this relation between progress and nature must also be reproduced constantly. The reproduction of this mindset is the key to the self-preservation of the species. And therefore, any kind of thought that is opposed or deviant from this mindset is judged with superstition. And it's judged with suspicion, sorry. It is judged as superstition and with suspicion. If you argue against the idea of progress at the expense of defenseless creatures, then you are taking to be against the survival of the species as a whole. That is why genuine thought, which detaches itself from that function, reason in its pure form, takes on the trait of madness, which down-to-earth people have never failed to observe. But as we said, this isn't a critique in favor of the freak event theory. Adorno and Horkheimer are not saying that we are freak events, even though the freak event theory can support a critique of anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism, it is still, according to them, too anthropomorphic. So anthropomorphism, if you remember, is when you project human characteristics onto the world. So the belief that we are an accident means that there is nothing anthropomorphic about the world, so it can be used as criticism. But as we've also pointed out many times before, Enlightenment itself is a rejection of anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism. And despite that, we've seen that it is extremely anthropocentric. Being a freak event, reason would then be just an instrument of adaptation. Given how different we are from the rest, being freaks, we are like aliens thrown in a world that is not suited for us. And so our only way for survival is by adapting to this harsh environment. And as such, we have to make a subject versus object relation. We are subjects that must turn everything else in the world as an object for our survival. So we simply hide this in the freak event theory by claiming that we are not imposing any anthropocentric worldview on the outside world because we are acting like animals. And so reason is for us what the claws and fangs are for the wild beast. But that is too anthropocentrism. It is anthropocentrism, but only in reverse. And so it is the task of philosophical interpretation to expose anthropomorphism because it is at the foundations of dominance over nature. As they write, a philosophical interpretation of world history would have to show how, despite all the detours and resistances, the systematic domination over nature has been asserted more and more decisively and has integrated all internal human characteristics. And so one way of doing that, to reduce the dominance of human beings over nature, is by, for example, comparing them to hypothetical beings that would be as evolved from us as we are from troglodytes. In this sense, we are talking about Paleolithic cave dwellers, or as we are from other animals. And these evolved beings can wipe us out as easily as we can wipe out entire species with our technology. But Adorno and Horkheimer, they don't really see the point of such thought experiment because it probably would remain nothing but a thought experiment. Like, they doubt whether a creature that would be more sophisticated than human beings can emerge as a product of natural history. Sure, creatures like human beings can emerge again after we are long gone, but for a species to reach a stage in evolution, the stage in evolution that we, as we are now, will be, cavemen by comparison to, other highly developed species. This is very doubtful for Adorno and Horkheimer. And so their reason for this doubt is because they see how human beings have evolved to the point where they can wipe out everything out of the surface of the earth. And that is doubtful to imagine that it is possible to evolve further from this point without, destroying everything. So we have a technology that we cannot control now. In the past, no conflict or war could threaten life as a whole on Earth, but with the technology that we have today, every conflict has always the potential of turning into an existential threat. So for the authors, evolution reaches a point where the technology a species develops at its peak will destroy that species, so it won't have a chance to evolve further. And so the only options we have as human beings is either we destroy all human beings, or we destroy all human beings plus the fauna and flora along with us. In either cases, the destruction of the species is taken for granted. As they say, the human capacity for destruction promises to become so great that once the species has exhausted itself, a tabula rasa will have been created. Either the human species will tear itself to pieces, or it will take all the Earth's fauna and flora down with it. And if the Earth is still young enough, the whole procedure, to vary a famous dictum, will have to start again on a much lower level. Now, tabula rasa means a clean or blank slate, when you wipe everything and start anew. And the asterisk is a reference from the German Ideology by Engels and Marx. They give a page number from the Engels and Marx Werkes, so works, the complete works of Marx and Engels, from the third volume. And I have to say, I'm not really sure why they refer to that passage, because maybe I got the wrong passage. Like from the German Ideology, I think a passage that makes more sense here is probably that human nature depends on the material conditions that determine production, which is at the beginning of the first section on Feuerbach. Like human beings determine themselves, they determine who they are through how they organize themselves around the process of production. Different organizations will make me see the world differently, and so produce different things out of that world. But those different organizations depend on the material conditions available to me. With the means at my disposal, I will produce something different than someone who has different means. So people living in tribes in the jungle, for example, have different material conditions than people living in big cities with electricity. So they will produce different things, have different relationship with the world around them. And so in short, they will produce with what they have at their disposal. So here in the passage from Adorno and Horkheimer, the variance of the dictum occurs in its application not to human beings but to the earth. The earth will produce what it can depending on the means it has at a certain time. And so what the passage suggests is that the consequences of human actions on the earth will leave it with just limited means to start the production of life all over again from scratch. Like after human beings destroy everything, Earth must redo its process on a smaller level. Or if we take the passage, which I think maybe this is the right one, it's on page 34 of the third volume. It's the third volume of the 1969 Berlin edition. And so in it, Marx and Engels, they talk about how communism is only possible on it is possible only on a global scale. Like you cannot have local communism because all of the proletariat need to rely on each other for their emancipation. And so maybe here Adorno and Horkheimer are saying that communism can only be achieved at a local level or at local levels, because if you try to have some sort of global communism that requires a technology that will escape our control and wipe us out, maybe that's not a good idea. But I'm not really sure about this interpretation. If you know why that passage was mentioned and if I got it wrong, please correct me in the comments. But anyways, I think that the point is the idea of human beings are insignificant in comparison to higher beings. This idea doesn't help, since there won't be any other stage further than the one we are in. But if we got to the stage, is because of our anthropocentric views. So how can we deconstruct them? Well, Adorno and Horkheimer, they argue that what is great about human ideas is their naivety. Our ideas as human beings aren't supposed to be taken seriously. What anthropomorphism does is precisely taking those ideas seriously, to the point where they are giving a metaphysical dimension that is way too big for them. By attributing human ideas as active powers to history and presenting them as history's culmination, the philosophy of history stripped them of the naivety inherent in their content. So when history is grasped as a progress of human ideas, what makes those ideas Well, not just human but humane. In the first place, it is their naive content, and that naive content is lost. It was precisely this naivety that maintained their humane aspect as well as their human aspect, and therefore gave us reason to cherish them. Without the seriousness attributed to those ideas, they couldn't become an instrument for domination. They weren't used as a way to mock the weak, to subjugate them, like we said, to inhumane treatment. When entrepreneurs, for example, take their ideas too seriously, nothing stops them from destroying the entire planet if that means fulfilling those ideas. Those who are weak and vulnerable can beat it. They should die for great ideas and see it as an honor. That's how your local Elon Musk thinks, and that's the highest form of mockery towards the weak and the disenfranchised. And as such, the authors of such ideas claim to be all about freedom and justice while enslaving those who don't have power on their side. The poor figure always cut by such ideas when the economy, that is, when power was not with them, makes a mockery of everything weak. And in this way, their authors have unwittingly identified themselves with the opposition they sought to abolish. So, Horkheimer discusses how certain ideas, presumably those advocating for social change or opposing oppression, can be marginalized or ridiculed when those in power do not support them. They also suggest that the very ideas meant to challenge oppression can end up being mocked, and the authors of such ideas unknowingly align themselves with the oppression they aim to eradicate. The asterisk refers to two passages from two works in Marxist literature, The Holy Family by Marx and Engels, and the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy by Marx. Again, they just refer to page numbers from volume 1 and 2 of the work. So I'm guessing again which passage they are referring to. So hopefully I got it right again. So the reference to the Holy Family is at page 85 of volume 2, 1957 edition. That's when Marx discusses what's called absolute criticism and the philosopher Bruno Bauer, who was a Hegelian teleologist. We don't need to understand what is absolute criticism here, or relative criticism for that matter. If the page I have is the correct one, all you need to know for our purposes here is that absolute criticism says that there are some self-evident and simple truths, and it is the purpose of history to prove them. Like the purpose of the plant is to be eaten by the animal and the animal by man, the purpose of history is to make simple truths true. But the truth it seeks to prove needs elaboration. Like it is self-evident that the sun rises every morning, but science has a sophisticated way to prove it. It's a simple truth, but requires one hell of explanation. Because of this, absolute criticism can come off as elitist, and therefore when it talks about simple truths, it's not in the sense that the masses take a simple truth. For absolute criticism, the masses don't understand the simple truths that they already take as self-evident. And so the irony is that absolute criticism claims that self-evident truths will liberate the masses. But their way towards liberation must go through the same kind of elaboration that the elite privileges. And so this is like in math, when you get the right answer, but the teacher gives you a bad grade because you didn't use the teacher's method. So because power isn't with the masses, because usually the masses are either poor or economically impotent compared to the elite, the ideas supposed to liberate them turn against them. And the same elite that promises to put an end to oppression becomes complicit with that oppression. So that's for the first reference, and the second reference from the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Rights is from the first volume of the Werke, page 385. If I got it right, it's the passage where Marx talks about how Germany has the most radical emancipatory theories, but is lagging behind other nations because it is not putting those theories in practice, to praxis. And because of that, those theories simply end up replacing authority with another. He brings in religion. I mean, it's not in that book where you have the phrase religion is the opium of the masses. It's in that book, sorry. It's in that book where you have that phrase religion is the opium of the masses. So religion is clearly the target here. What he says about religion comes in the critique of Martin Luther, the father of Protestantism. And as you know, Luther was very critical of Catholicism, because he argues that the Catholic Church is basically using faith to maintain authority. So what he wanted was to liberate faith from authority, but what he did was to make faith the new authority. Like now, we have to work our asses off forever because that's what God, not the priests or the Pope, want. So as always, you have an idea that can liberate, but because you stay trapped in abstract theories and don't want to commit to praxis, you turn that idea into an even more oppressive system. An example of this process of how ideas are that are supposed to be liberating turn into their opposite by this philosophy of history is the concept of the good in Christianity. Now, the idea of the good turns into a theodicy, meaning a battle between good and evil, with good eventually winning and triumphing at the end. So Christianity gave history this pattern. All of history is the unfolding of God's plan, which is the good is in battle against evil, and the good will be victorious at the end. So its victory is given as an imminent law, like it is out of necessity that the good will triumph over evil. That's because the good in Christianity is basically the word spirit. And so the world, when it exists in its real form, is the good because everything God makes is good. So the good is the essence of the world, it is its spirit, and so like all essences, it wants to actualize itself. The good doesn't want to remain in abstraction, it wants to be concrete. So the world is pushed towards a state in which the good is now immanent. So that would be the second coming, when Jesus comes back and we all see the reality of this world, the revelation, when the veil covering our eyes and leading us astray from God and the good is finally lifted. But this doesn't help. On the contrary, it turns Christianity into a dogma. Quote, but not only in history thereby turned into its direct opposite, but the idea which was supposed to break the necessity, the logical course of events, is itself distorted. So what is meant is that Christianity is supposed to liberate people from suffering. The meek shall inherit the earth is a slogan for freedom and the end of oppression. So Christianity is supposed to break the necessity of events, not confirm it. So when you are oppressed in a system, your oppression is rationalized to appear like a necessity. Women had to be oppressed by the patriarchy because it was a necessity. That's how nature and the gods decided. Black people had to be, by necessity and logic, inferior to white men. Jews had to be, the slaves of the pharaohs, etc. And so these systems must repeat themselves in order for society to survive and maintain itself. Kings have to rule, servants have to be ruled. But when Christianity brought its idea of the good, it was supposed to break this pattern. The good in Christianity would liberate the oppressed. But what it did was, it made their suffering even more necessary and logical. The suffering of the slaves, of the sick, of the poor, the unfortunate was now taken to mean that we are God's favorites. The good is making them suffer, and their plight is contributing to the triumph of that good. Their sacrifice will lead to the ultimate reward. So it is no longer the good is supposed to work for liberating the slaves. Now the sufferings of the slaves serves as justification for the good. And as such, Christianity, like it avoids the freak event theory. Humanity isn't a freak event, but it is the plan of God to bring out the good. And it also avoids the freak event of suffering. Human beings don't see their suffering as gratuitous, as if not warranted. It gives reason for their suffering, which makes them unable to avoid that suffering. So suffering is, after all, the best instrument for organizing populations. When you make someone suffer, you take away their power, they become impotent, and therefore you can organize their life in the way that you want. But what is even more efficient is to make them unaware of their impotence. You deny it by telling them that their impotence, their lack of power, is itself power. The meek shall inherit the earth has the meaning that in their lack of power, the meek will have all the power. And so impotence is denied twice in this philosophy of history. First, it is denied in progress, like with the defenseless creatures in lab, the guinea pigs whose suffering contributes to medicine. And second, it is denied in itself, like impotence cannot even be impotence, but its opposite. Imagine someone so impotent that he cannot even be impotent. And so the philosophy of history turns ideas into their opposite by elevating them to a higher state as a contributor to the good and to power. And so this allows the philosophy of history to conclude that everything is justifiable since it all contributes to the good. Whatever philosophy of history, Christianity, idealism, or materialism, they all get a pass. In this way, Christianity, idealism, and materialism, which in themselves contain truth, also bear guilt for the villainies committed in their name. So when ideas are taken seriously, they give themselves power, even a benign power like in the case of Christianity. And with that power, they now organize people in ways that have bloody consequences. The philosophy of history has always had bloody consequences on real history. And so for this reason, Adorno and Horkheimer adopt pessimistic views regarding progress and especially the idea of the good. For them, whenever these notions are on the rise, thought brings out the worst in them. And so history isn't about bringing out the good, but horror. And therefore the role of thought and reason isn't to give argument and justification in favor of history. Thought isn't to comfort the Pope or Stalin in their promises of the good. It's not supposed to tell us how to guarantee that good, but rather to criticize the dogma of the good. So they say the hope for better conditions, insofar as it is not merely an illusion, is founded less on the assurance that those conditions are guaranteed, sustainable, and final than on a lack of respect for what is so firmly ensconced amid the general suffering. So in other words, Adorno and Horkheimer, they are rejecting any prescriptive notion in history. Prescriptive means how things should be. When I tell you to hit the gym because your health is deteriorating, I am making a prescriptive claim. You have to go to the gym because it's in your own good. When history itself becomes prescriptive, then that's how we run into horrors. We prescribe praxis. We tell the world this is how you should be, this is how you should act, this is how you should be organized. And so philosophies like Christianity, idealism, and materialism have been administrating a praxis. Priests telling us that history and our suffering is part of God's praxis, God's plan. Idealists that history is the praxis of our ideas. Materialists that history is praxis towards communism. Capitalists that everything is a praxis for profit, etc. But Adorno and Horkheimer argue that when we look at life, at biodiversity, at living organisms, we don't find any praxis. As they write, the infinite patience, the tender, never extinguished impulse of creaturely life toward expression and light, which seems to soften and pacify within itself the violence of creative evolution, does not, like the rational philosophies of history, prescribe a certain praxis as beneficial, not even that of non-resistance. So this is kind of like Taoism, like in Taoism, which is an ancient Chinese philosophy. Like there is the Tao, which means the way. Sometimes it's translated as the way, and this way simply unfolds, but without following any praxis. And Adorno and Horkheimer, they seem to be going in that direction. When you try to apply praxis, you're going to bring in reason, and the problem for reason is that it cannot do what it hopes to do, which is to avoid calamity. If anything, it seems to only unleash it more uncontrollably. The light of reason, which dawned in that impulse and is reflective in the recollecting thought of human beings, falls even on the happiest day on its irresolvable contradiction, the calamity which reason alone cannot avert. And so this being said, we get the idea. Praxis is progress, and so to resist praxis is therefore to resist progress. And so the next fragment is going to keep on to developing even more this idea of how ideas, they turn into their opposite, and how, by turning into their opposite, they become, a praxis, and why praxis leads to all of these calamities, and how it leads to all of these contradictions. So the next fragment is called the transformation of the idea into power. So in this note, we have an actual example of how resisting progress can be more revolutionary than progress. From the title of the note, you get that Adorno and Horkheimer are going to talk about a process in which the idea turns into power. Now, what's the idea? Well, in this note, the idea is taken in its Hegelian sense. To make things simple, the idea is truth. But when it exists in the form of an idea, it is abstract, and so it needs to become concrete. How? Well, by taking a political form. So take the idea of freedom, for example. People have been organizing society based on that idea, among other ideas. But at first, their understanding of the idea wasn't very bright, and it was filled with contradictions. Some would have freedom, for example, while others would be slaves. But by going through a series of trials and errors, the idea of freedom evolves. People start coming up with new political regimes in which their notion of freedom won't be contradicting itself. Now, you won't have people as free men and others as slaves. So from a political organization in which you have free men and slaves, you move to one where all men are free, but still there are privileges, etc. So you move on to another one where, privileges are abolished, etc., etc. And so at first, freedom is understood as a matter of force, for example. Whomever beats you has freedom over you. But as we progress, we move from tyrannies to monarchies, to republics, to democracies, etc. When we follow this process, we are supposed to get to a stage where the idea is coherent with itself, and that's when it becomes true. Science works in the same way. Our knowledge progresses, it goes through stages. We were in the dark hundreds of years ago, for example, but eventually we are supposed to get to a point where there will be a way to know if something is true. But here Adorno and Horkheimer are going to argue that this progress of the idea isn't much about progress as it is about power. The idea isn't progressing towards truth, but it is transforming into power. It is transforming itself into a tool for oppression. In other words, it's another critique of progress, and how progress is making us more subject to power when its project is to liberate us from power. And they explain this by arguing that there are tendencies in today's society, in the 40s, since that's when the book was written, that look like the same tendencies that we can see 2,000 years ago. And they explain how progress leads to more domination than emancipation. So first they focus on the Upanishads, on Jesus, the Stoics, and Buddha as examples of this process. So the Upanishads are sacred books in Hinduism, parts of the Vedas, and so Vedantism is a school of Hinduism. We don't need to know what it is exactly for our purposes here, just that there are sacred texts in Indian religion. And Jesus needs no introduction, and Stoicism is an ancient Greco-Roman philosophy, very popular today, by the way. And I already did a small explanation of what it is in my critique of the ethical slut. It's right there here if you want to see it. And I also mentioned Buddhism in that video. So no need to go over them again. Now the authors tell us that these four, Upanishads, Jesus, Buddha, and Stoicism, were a step beyond what was before them. They are a progress of the ideas that existed before. The Upanishads were the latest books in the Vedas and were like attempts at reforming the religion which was believed to be decaying. They mentioned Paul Gunzelin, I think that's how it is pronounced. He was a German historian and philosopher. He was a friend of Nietzsche and was very influenced by Schopenhauer and Hinduism. And he wrote a lot on the Vedas and the Upanishads. And the authors are going to use his thesis, which argues that the Upanishads are a progress of Brahman's order. And Buddha did the same thing with the Brahmin's order as well. He was a step beyond, like Jesus was a step beyond John the Baptist, and the Stoics were beyond the Cynics. So John the Baptist, a preacher known for baptizing people. In Islam, he's known as Yahya. And so we're not going to go through the whole story, just what is relevant here. In the Bible, he is known for baptizing people, as we said, and he was like the top preacher of his time. But he said that there is someone who is stronger than him and who will come soon, and he's referring to Jesus. And so in the footnotes, Adorno and Horkheimer refer to the Gospel of Matthew, and they refer specifically to Matthew 2, verse 17 to 19. But I think it's a mistake. Actually, it's in Matthew 3, verse 13 to 17. There you have the story of Jesus' baptism by John, where John was like, you want me to baptize you, bro? I should be baptized by you, you know? And so it's the same thing with the cynics. They are philosophers who reject civilization altogether and want to live according to nature. And so etymologically speaking, cynicism comes from kinikoi, which in Greek means dogs. So cynics are people who live like dogs. So basically they're hobos. They live according to their basic natural needs, and they find in this the expression of virtue and freedom. They're hippies, basically. And the Stoics like the idea of being self-sufficient, to rely on nothing else but one's nature. But they thought that rejecting civilization was too radical, and so the Stoics like that idea, but they thought that rejecting civilization was too radical, and so they took some of that, they took some sort of middle ground, if you want. The Stoics, you know, they agreed with the Cynics on self-efficiency and following one's nature, but not go all the way as rejecting civilization. So here the Upanishad, Jesus, Buddha, and the Stoics are seen as better versions of what came before them. They are literally progress. But what Adorno and Horkheimer defend here is that what came before them, quote, look much more like left-wing secessionists' tendencies which have split off from powerful cliques and parties than central tendencies of historical movements from which European philosophy, Christianity, and the living Vedic religion themselves branched off. In other words, the old versions of the idea were more radical, more uncompromising with the current order, and so more progressive than their progressive versions. So the Cynics were more progressive than the Stoics, and John the Baptist was more progressive than Jesus. And so the ones before were more radical in the sense that they were a complete rejection of what was going on. Cynics completely broke off with civilization, seeing it as inherently corrupting, but the Stoics were the centrist ones, the ones about, compromise. They are basically reformists. And so reformists are, of course, more inclined towards the right than ever are towards the left. Adorno and Horkheimer are left-wing, of course, and it's because they are radicals, as in they are radically opposed to progress. Not technology in itself, but the idea of progress as understood by Enlightenment standards. Reformists don't want to lose their privileges, and so they will betray the revolutionary potential of those who were radicals. Regarding the Upanishad, for example, they write, accordingly, as Gunzelin himself notes, the Upanishad is usually placed at the beginning of Indian collections, long before the writings it is said to have gone beyond. Yet this first work itself shows traces of a betrayal, of youthful radicalism, of treachery against revolutionary opposition to the dominant reality. So the Upanishad, Jesus, Buddha, Stoics, as centrists, and it is those against progress that actually were the revolutionaries, they began attempts at creating unified theoretical systems in which everything can be incorporated, including the present order. So centrists have the rhetoric of, we can have the best of both worlds despite evidence that the two worlds cannot be unified in one system. When they participate in social reality, it is only to make it fit within their own system. And therefore they will come up with excuses and reasons why revolutionary action are to be discouraged and only allowed when they don't harm the system in question. They will say something like, the radicalism of cynics is noble, but it harms the soul. We need a civilized version of it. So centrists therefore rely on, as the authors write, the doctrine that an active role in life need not to be harmful to the salvation of the soul, provided one has the right spiritual outlook. So we have a right spiritual outlook. There is a right way to be a believer. There's a right way to be a Hindu. There's a right way to be a cynic. The right way to be a cynic is to be a Stoic, right? Because Stoicism is the right conduct in life, the only conduct that doesn't harm the salvation of your soul. So centricism is therefore a weakening of revolutionary sentiment. They take their basis from those who spark that sentiment, but they don't want to go all the way in. And so their idea turns against itself, and that's how the idea turns into a religion. These progressive figures, the Upanishad, Jesus, Buddha, and Stoics, they do have disdain towards progress and civilization. Like the radicals before them, they see progress and civilization as instances of decadence and recommend that one puts some distance between them and the current state. They do call for an abstraction from social reality when they participate in it. The authors mention St. Paul, who brought this distance to its extreme. Paul wrote that those who follow these teachings, they stood aloof from the desire for children, the desire for wealth, the desire for the world, and wandered about as beggars, for the desire for children is a desire for property, and the desire for property is a worldly desire, and both alike are vain. But as while Paul praises them, those who who cut themselves off from praxis, he also blames and censors them because you need something else than just maintaining a distance with worldly desires and possessions. You need to have the love of Christ as well. If you don't have Christ in your heart as a beggar, then you are just a beggar and will look like a madman. It's good that you revolt, but what's the point of rebellion if it doesn't serve the kingdom of God? So you certainly speak the truth when you say that you should abstain from world desires, but we need still a social practice. Even if you cut yourself from social practice, you still need a social practice. So the idea cannot be personal. You cannot have people randomly in a decentralized fashion practicing these spiritual exercises. You need them to organize, and you need to organize them. There has to be an authority, there has to be collective rituals and systems of ethics and morality. So the word decentralized is important here. It's not that the radical philosophers didn't produce any theory or system or even an order. They actually did set up at least parts of a systematic doctrines of a code of behavior. And Adorno and Horkheimer, they gave a few examples. Even more radical Upanishads attacked the Issa Upanishad, where verses and sacrificial formulae used by priest guilds. John the Baptist may not have inaugurated a religion, but he did found an order. The Cynics founded a school of philosophers. Its founder, Antisthenes, even sketched the outlines of a theory of the state. But their ideas on purpose lacked a structure. It was this characteristic that brought them the criticism of their less radical counterpart. Those perceived as progress only insist on the importance of having a center, whereas the radical ones reject a center. And as such, they were perceived as being more focused on the individual, which always scares the shit out of power, than on administered collective organization. Quote, the theoretical and practical systems of such historical outsiders were unstructured, without a center, and differed from the successful systems by a streak of anarchy. The idea of the individual mean more to them than administration and collective. So the term administration is also important. Of course, collective action is important, and we've been arguing for it in many videos, but here it's like pseudo-individuating. Power wants to administer collective action like it wants to administer individuality. And for most of history, administrating the collective was seen as the most efficient way for governing than administrating individuality. A lack of structure in the radicals' thought was seen as chaos, where individuals don't answer to a higher order anymore. It's seen like when old people look at young people. Youth in the eyes of the old is chaotic and hubristic. This is how the radicals are seen by the centrists, teenagers, and so they provoke anger. And so even ideas that reject the present order, they must obey an order. There has to be an order around which people who believe in the absence of order organize themselves. It's like saying that my religion is the absence of religion. And that's how a religion is created, how the idea turns into a religion and censors those who came before it. So John the Baptist was, according to the authors, depicted as a madman. They quote from Mark 1:6, and for the cynics, they may have the right way of life individually, but because they were too radical, they couldn't organize and provide a coherent system. The authors mention Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy, where he gives how cynics were portrayed by Stoics, with whom, of course, he agrees. Hegel agrees with the Stoics, and he says that the cynics were, they were full of shit. And Adorno and Horkheimer also mentioned Plato, who has shared the same criticism regarding the cynics. The radicals, quote, therefore become madmen, and did indeed resemble John the Baptist. He was clothed with camel's hair and had a girdle of skin about his loins, and he did eat locusts and wild honey. The cynics, says Hegel, have little philosophical training and never managed to produce a system, a science. Only later was their system made a philosophical discipline by the Stoics. Swinish, shameless beggars, he called these successors. Plato, the champion of power, had the cynics in his sight when he railed against equating the office of kings with that of a common shepherd, and compared a loose organization of humanity without national frontiers to a state of swine. So the two references in Plato in which he is against equating the office of the king with the common shepherds and the state of swine come respectively from the Statement and the Republic. These are two dialogues written by Plato. The state of swine, swine means pigs, is a bit problematic here. That comes in the second book of the Republic. In that book, Plato, through Socrates, is laying the principles of the ideal city, what the ideal city would look like. And in book 2, Socrates talks with a guy named Glaucon, who happens to be Plato's brother. And at first, Socrates imagined a state in which people would just live off their basic needs. It's a state of simplicity, but Glaucon says, ironically, that it would be a city of pigs. And so what he means by this is that people need more than just having their needs met in order to love and enjoy life. We're not just talking about, luxuries, but culture here, art, gymnastics, philosophy, science, etc. But Plato doesn't make an argument about how the lack of national frontiers would lead to a city of pigs, which, as we saw, simply meant a city of simplicity and not of what we usually associate with pigs. And so although there is a double meaning of the word, because Plato does acknowledge that human beings seem to be inclined to extravagance, like what Plato wants is a state of moderation and with joy and fulfillment, but without excess. And pigs can have that significance. They are a symbol for excess and hubris. But the city of pigs already has frontiers. So probably, in the Republic, the city of Pig already has frontiers. So probably what Adorno and Horkheimer meant by nation without frontiers, we have a state of swine, is without a national culture. Will be a city of simplicity, or of people who simply live off their basic needs, or will be people who don't want to go further than what's at the tip of their nose. So we won't aspire to greatness, okay, so maybe, which is kind of the rhetoric that you hear a lot from nationalists, by the way, that we need nationalism and borders to protect our culture, which makes us wanting to transcend ourselves. Nationalism always has this fetish in strong men, and it is thanks to their greatness that we are not living like animals. So we need fascist national frontiers in order to cultivate that greatness, so that we don't get stuck in our basic needs. But these great men have another function. They limit our tendency towards excess, because simple people or normal people, if they want more than their basic needs, they are likely to fall into excess and hubris. So there is a distinction, there is a hierarchy between simple folks at the bottom and those at the top who supervise the pigs. And those at the top are going to be the philosophers, who are also like the kings. They're also the kings, sorry. So there is a disdain towards individual behavior, like people are either too basic or they have no control over their desires. And so they need to be ruled by those at the top. And so the ideal city of Plato is a city ruled by the famous philosopher kings. And despite the fact that these kings are specifically trained and educated to be distrustful of power, like the philosopher king is someone who doesn't like power. He doesn't want that. He's even trained to reject power. And so they are more distrustful. They are certainly distrustful of power, but they are more distrustful of individuals than power. And so so you get the idea. And the other reference is from the Dialogue of the Statement, in which it's not Socrates who is the lead of the dialogue, but a stranger from Elea who comes to Athens. And this guy tries to define what is the statement. And he blames the current decadence of the city on the fact that those who are in charge, the statesmen, are not competent because they are not experts in politics. Statesmen like shepherds who only care for their flocks in order to exploit them, to eat them, or to sell them. Now there is a distinction between the good and the bad shepherd, between the one who looks after his flock out of genuine care and the one who just exploits his flock. And in a section, the stranger from Elea talks about the reign of Kronos. Now the reign of Kronos was a mythical time in Greek mythology where Kronos was the king of the gods, well, of Titans technically, if you want to be precise. He's the father of Zeus, but whatever. His time was like a golden age where it was spring all year and food was just everywhere and people didn't have to work and everyone was happy and stuff. And in that time, the gods were like shepherds to men in the genuine sense, like they cared for us. And we then cared for the animals like the god did with us. It's like an Eden myth. And so when it was over, people started to be bad and we turned into bad shepherds. We started exploiting animals and then we moved to exploiting each other. But the real reason why people became bad shepherds is because we don't live in the golden age anymore. It's not that we are bad people, but that we don't have the knowledge for the kind of world we found ourselves in after the golden age. Like the shepherd is an expert in the golden age where there are no winters and food is always available, but when seasons came and food had to be produced, shepherds are out of their fields of expertise regarding politics. Shepherds are good at managing animal stock, but not when it comes to human affairs. And so those things should be left to those who have the knowledge. But our problem is that we are giving the offices of statesmen to people who don't belong to them, who have no idea how to run a state. So shepherds shouldn't be kings. And so the problem is that, to go back to the cynics, the problem is that the cynics, they want to live as if they are still in the golden age. They want to live like shepherds. And so the underlying meaning is that cynics don't know what they are doing. And by extension, individuals don't know what they are doing when it comes to governance. And so this is the big beef here. Like people at the bottom or who want to be equal with those who live at the bottom, the simpletons, should not be taken seriously because they are ignorant and don't know what is in their best interest, or even in the best interest of others. Now sure, Plato's Republic was pretty progressive compared to the common views in his time, especially when it comes to women, for example. He believed that women are equal to men, and there is no reason to deny them the education to become, rulers too. But still, those he criticizes were more radical than he was. And the same is true with Buddha. As for him, Adorno and Horkheimer use again Gunzelin and the biography of the Buddha by Hermann Oldenburg to show how the Buddha wasn't that progressive, kind of like Plato, even if he technically was more inclusive than Plato. They mention how, contrary to other reformists, Gautama, that's the first that's the first Buddha's name. Gautama didn't include lower orders from learning, didn't exclude the lower orders from learning of his doctrine, but that he still acknowledged poverty, and his disciples were mostly sons of noble families, and he had rarely pariahs among them. Like, his circles were still based on the Brahmins' social model. In Hinduism, you have the Brahmins' model of social hierarchy. Society has 4 classes or castes. They're called the Varna. At the top, you have the Brahmins, which are the priests. Then the, not sure of the pronunciation, the Kshatruais, the warriors. Then you have the farmers and the merchant, and then finally you have the artisan, the servants, and the slaves, the Shudras. That's the last one. And the farmers, I think it is pronounced the Vaishyas. I'm not sure, but yeah, you have 4 classes. So it looks like the Republic of Plato, in which you had the philosophers at the top, a class of warriors, and then farmers, artisans, and servants. But the Brahmins are like, it's by birthright that I belong to, that you belong to each Varna. Whereas in Plato, it's more based on merit. And even though Buddha challenged Brahmin's order, his disciples were still differentiated on that model. Like, you won't find many people from the Shudras in the circles of the Buddha, despite the fact that he said that his teachings should also be communicated to them. If you are a cripple, a criminal, a sick, etc., you were denied admission. You can learn Buddhism, you can achieve enlightenment, but you won't be hanging with Gautama's crew. And so even women had a hard time getting in, and even those who did, they were admitted reluctantly, and they had to be inferior to the men. So even if there was no official caste system within Buddhism, you still had a lot of discrimination that reflected the caste system. As Adorno and Horkheimer write, have you applicants were asked leprosy, scrofula, white leprosy, consumption, epilepsy? Are you a human being? Are you a man? Are you your own master? Are you without debts? Are you in the king's service, etc., and so on? So the point is these reformers were reformers insofar as they agreed with power. That those who make initiative from the bottom are to be mistrusted because it is believed that if you are coming from the bottom, then you won't have the skills required to show that you know what you are talking about. People like shepherds are less likely to provide consistent and coherent systems, which is suspected as a lack of knowledge about the world. But someone who doesn't have to provide a coherent and systematic account of the world in order to be taken seriously, but that's, the standard imposed by these reformers. Like, they are represented as good-willing, they want to unite, they want to cooperate, but because they couldn't, or more precisely, weren't looking for providing a systematic account of reality, they were not taken seriously. So they say the uncompromising spirits may have been willing to unite and cooperate, but they lacked the skill to construct a solid hierarchy close to those from below, neither in their theory, which was without uniformity or consistency, nor in their practice, which lacked the cohesion to make an impact. Did they themselves reflect the world as it actually was? And so this brings us today, or to Adorno and Horkheimer's times. The same pattern is going on. And it's even more ironic today because those who act like Plato, Jesus, Buddha, the Stoics, etc., are claiming to be revolutionaries, to be radicals. The irony was already present since the times of the Upanishads. Like Gunzelin has put the Issa Upanishad, the most progressive of the Upanishad, in the beginning of the collection, when the Issa Upanishad is criticizing the other texts which were, supposedly written before it. It's like the progressive becomes the original state and becomes the golden age. And the order that was before it and it was criticizing came after it. That's weird. Like the reformists criticizing the present become nostalgic of the past. Like at first you had the reformists, and then the present is a corruption of the reformists' ideas. It's like, originally you have Stoicism, and then the cynics have just screwed it up, when in reality cynicism came before Stoicism. So with modern times, it's the same thing. The revolutionaries become the nostalgic ones and place themselves as having the right doctrine, but many screwed it up. Many deviated from the initial teachings. Here, Adorno and Horkheimer have the Marxists that brought Stalinism in mind. Like the revolutionaries became the reactionaries. They are even more reactionary than the reactionaries that they criticize. So the nostalgic fixation is often a right-wing and conservative attitude, but the progressive revolutionaries don't seem to be any better. And Adorno and Horkheimer don't mention this, but the way Stalinists treated anarchists during the fascist period of Spain is very similar to how Plato and the Stoics treated the Cynics. But the authors just focus here on ideas, materialism, and asceticism. Materialism is the philosophy on which Marxism is based, and it is often opposed to asceticism, which is the negation of the body. When people, for example, they learn to resist their body drives and focus on their souls or spirituality. Asceticism is learning to detach yourself from earthly things, from material things. And so Marxism often criticizes this as a way for the elite to justify its domination. By denying the existence of the material world, those whose labor is exploited cannot really complain anymore. When you are hungry because you are poor, you should practice ascetic meditation instead of revolting. So when the poor revolt, they're portrayed as materialistic and vile, like they accord too much importance on material values and not enough on spiritual and moral ones. So asceticism is portrayed by materialism as a tool for power and control over the masses. And it is also viewed as archaic and ignorant as well. Materialism is of course based on science, on the idea that we understand the world through science because the world is physical. Since science only reveals to us the material aspect of the world, the belief in spirituality, souls, and spirit become equated with ignorance, just an order that needs to be transcended. And so materialism is a step beyond asceticism, like Jesus was a step beyond John the Baptist. However, the point that Adorno and Horkheimer have been making throughout the whole book is that what is true about progress can also be true about its opposite. Progress does liberate and emancipate, but so does its counterpart. And the critique of progress to its counterpart also applies to progress. What materialism blames asceticism for, asceticism can also blame materialism. Asceticism can be the most radical of the two. It can be more emancipating and liberating than materialism, and even meets the material demands of the masses. Quote, asceticism as a refusal to participate in the bad existing order coincides in face of oppression with the material demands of the masses, just as conversely asceticism as an agent of discipline imposed by cliques aims at adaptation to injustice. The materialistic acceptance of the status quo, individual egoism, has always been linked to renunciation, while the gaze of the unworldly zealot, roving beyond the existing order, rests materialistically on the land of milk and honey. So what they mean by this is that materialism turns out to be more narrow than asceticism and less radical than asceticism. Asceticism's denial of the body is also a denial of the bad existing order, as they say. It is not renunciation to the status quo, but fight against it. When the masses turn to asceticism, they're not being misled. They're not shepherds who need the materialist king's philosophy to save them. They are actually trying to organize themselves in order to get their material needs and rights met. In other words, they have knowledge and can resist without producing an accurate and systematic comprehension of the world by the standards of enlightenment. Even if asceticism can be an agent of discipline to force the masses to adapt to injustice, it still has a great revolutionary potential, perhaps greater than materialism. And so the idea that the ascetic person is an unworldly zealot makes them freer than materialist revolutionaries, since their goal is the land of milk and honey. That's the promised land in the Bible, a land of abundance and eternal prosperity. And so the ascetic zealot has more freedom in terms of imagination and potential because nothing stands in his way to freedom, contrary to the materialist who accepts the status quo of individual egoism. So materialism becomes closer to renunciation and reaction than asceticism. The materialist is closer to acceptance of fate than the ascetic. Again, the denial of the body means a refusal to accept the present order. It can mean that. It is uncompromising in the sense that if resisting the bad order means that I have to believe in fairy tales and have beliefs that would make me sound like a madman to the ears of the world, then I'll be a crazy hobo roaming the streets for the rest of my life. And so likewise today, if resisting progress will make me sound like a fool, then I'll be a fool. I will believe in magic since it liberates me politically from the limits imposed on me by power. So if I truly want a world where my material demands are met, I can only get to it through asceticism and idealism. So the goal of the materialist are best served through asceticism. And likewise, an idealism without materialism won't make sense either. If I don't believe of an actual land of milk and honey, then my asceticism is reactionary. That is why a true materialism cannot exist without a true asceticism sublated within it, and vice versa. And that is why it is important for social movements to remain uncompromising and radical, even if they look like John the Baptist. That's how the idea remains free from becoming power, and for that it needs to criticize with all its might the principle of self-preservation. I don't need to explain what that is, we've covered it enough times already, the principle of self-preservation. And so to conclude this note, we should learn something from those ancient schools and their history. As they say, the history of those ancient religions and schools, like that of the modern parties and revolutions, can teach us that the price of survival is a practical complicity, the transformation of the idea into power. So in order to learn from those ancient schools, we ought to take the problem at its roots. We need to think about the underlying principle of progress and praxis, which is the division of labor. And that's the next fragment, philosophy and the division of labor. So the division of labor requires a constant survey over each branch of labor. The principle of the division is efficiency, and as such there has to be a knowledge to determine what is efficient and how to exploit it. Knowledge itself is therefore divided with each form of knowledge, serving industries and administrations to better work efficiently. And by efficiently we mean to organize society in certain ways that everything in it works for the interests of the system. Science, for example, is limited to just recording facts and connecting them for material use. The point of science is to provide accurate information for the industries to use. It is a guideline for exploitation. Quote, it must enable individual industries immediately to locate the desired intellectual commodity in the required variety. You can think of psychology, for example, and how it is used by industries to either sell us well-being or develop more management techniques in order to exploit the labor force more efficiently. Every science within the division of labor follows the same principle. Even history, according to the authors, serves as an eye for individual industries to sell products and control labor. They argue that in the case of history, it is not the industries that use it directly, but administrations. History serves as the basis of how to administer movement and production. They mention Machiavelli, his famous book, The Prince, which is basically a manual on how to maintain power. And Machiavelli uses history to derive advice for the princes to maintain their power. In the same way, history is utilized today by economists and politicians for control. It is either used for creating national novels, les romans nationaux, or to justify economic systems. And so in this division, philosophy too has its place. What is known as official philosophy is the philosophy of the state. It's the philosophy that is taught in textbooks in high schools and universities. Now, to be precise, it is not the philosophy taught that is a problem. Official philosophy isn't much about the content, but rather the way philosophy is being taught that makes it official, and also the purpose of its teachings. As they write, official philosophy serves the science which functions in this way. It is supposed, like a kind of intellectual Taylorism, to improve scientific production methods, to rationalize the accumulation of knowledge, and prevent the waste of mental energy. And so this can mean many things. First, philosophy must serve the science, means that it must improve the system of production. What philosophy must do is come up with innovative ways to make the process of production more efficient. If philosophy cannot improve the scientific production methods, then it is worthless. If it cannot contribute to the rationalization of the accumulation of knowledge, we don't need it. By this we mean that if philosophy cannot provide arguments in favor of the accumulation of knowledge and then the use of that knowledge in the service of industries, then we have no need for it. And second, philosophy must prevent any waste of mental energy. The point of philosophy here is to make student productive, meaning that they have to keep their cognitive abilities working for no other purpose than productivity. And so Adorno and Horkheimer probably have analytic philosophy in mind here, which is basically doing exercises in logic for no other reason than for the sake of doing exercises. Like you bring in students and you make them do logic just so that they don't waste mental energy. It is also some training into the ideology of the machine, thinking only in terms of logic instead of experience or metaphysics. Analytic philosophy is itself a product of positivism. More precisely, the authors have in mind logical positivism, which we already talked about in the concept of enlightenment. But it also has another reason behind it. Like reducing philosophy to just a mental practice aims at portraying philosophy as just a series of people getting things wrong. Philosophy professors who do courses on the history of philosophy have actually the job of showing why philosophers, ever since Plato, got things wrong. So the historian of philosophy is basically saying that everything that philosophy did up to this day was preparing the stage for enlightenment. Each philosopher is a step forward in progress because he proved his predecessor wrong. So philosophy is reduced to just that. The point of philosophy is to prove that philosophy is wrong. And whether philosophy is tolerated or giving some credit, it is not for its content, but because it can have some reactionary or paradoxically conservative potential. Philosophy up to that point in universities was mostly idealist philosophy. Institutional establishment always had great defiance regarding materialist philosophers, since they are often associated with Marxism and communism. Now, a lot of academics are openly left-wing, but the right-wing and conservative attacks are still current. I'm talking about like today, like this sentence is about today, 21st century. In the days of Adorno and Horkheimer, philosophy teaching was predominantly conservative and right-wing. As they say, the few philosophical residues which hark back to the divine worship of the Middle Ages or the contemplation of eternal essentialities are still tolerated as secular universities because they are so reactionary. In addition, a few historians of philosophy continue to propagate themselves by tirelessly expounding Plato and Descartes while pointing out their obsoleteness. So they also add that academic philosophy is also accompanied by a veteran of sensualism or an expert personalist. Sensualism and personalism are contemporary philosophies of the time of Adorno and Horkheimer. They emerged during the late 19th and 20th century, and they're both individualistic philosophies, meaning that they solely focus on the individual. But the problem with these philosophies is that they don't care much about science and claim that philosophy and science shouldn't mix, that philosophy is too noble and pure and therefore it must be put into practice for the happiness of the individual. And the reason why this is problematic is because Philosophy, well, it's about dialectics, and the division of labor in knowledge meant that disciplines can no longer have a dialectical relationship with each other. Each science must be separate from others, and even within that science, its branches must also be kept separate from one another. And so the issue is that without dialectical communication between the sciences, there is no progress, and there's also less resistance to the use of sciences we described minutes ago. Like reactionaries argue that the separation is done for the sake of clarity, but the consequence is that now all of the disciplines serve only one goal, that of efficiency. Philosophy, however, doesn't aim at efficiency, but it aims at truth. If efficiency goes contrary to truth, philosophy steps in and be like, you need to check yourself. And so the dialectical process aims precisely at not letting a one-sided view run the whole show. And so the division of labor acts like it's letting all disciplines coexist with one another, but simply coexisting doesn't mean anything. It's like you say, I let all of the molecules coexist together as long as they don't mix. You know, if molecules don't mix, nothing is created, right? And so the dialectic precisely does that. It mixes. And therefore, philosophy cannot be restricted to the division of labor. It cannot, it actually resists the division of labor because it resists prescribed tasks. You cannot give a task to a philosopher because he will wreck your shit with all kinds of questions about ethics, epistemology, metaphysics concerning that task. Like, what's the nature of the task? Why does it have to be done? What's the nature of the authority telling me to do the task? Is it a legitimate authority? Is the task even ethical? What principle does it correspond to? Does it have any ideology behind it? What kind of social mechanism would produce such tasks, etc.? And so here the authority will either use physical force to make you do the task, or it will use a more sinister way. It'd be like, hey, I'm not ordering you to do anything, I'm just making a suggestion. And so the authority will pretend that it is not coercing you into doing anything, but it simply suggests that you do something, which of course, if you don't, you will be socially insignificant. In other words, a philosopher doesn't like suggestions. I suggest that you do this means that I have all the data on my side. I know everything already to be done. The only thing left for you to decide is whether to do the task or not. If you don't, we will find someone else desperate enough to do it without questioning our knowledge, and that is a suggestion. And as such, the goal of philosophy is nothing but to resist suggestions. As they say, philosophy is not a synthesis, a basic science, or an overarching science, but an effort to resist suggestion, a determination to protect intellectual and actual freedom. So, dialectical reasoning is often characterized as aiming at a synthesis or at being a science, whether basic or overarching, but this is not really the goal of philosophy. Rather, dialectical reasoning here is to make sure that intellectual freedom is protected, and from it actual freedom too. The dialectics is more of an awareness of the presence of another realm of existence which cannot be absorbed into a totalizing one. The totalizing principle argues for a synthesis, but the synthesis for totalitarian regimes is only coexistence. As long as we don't mix and everyone remains fixed in their place, we are good. But that is a lie, and philosophy exists to expose the lies that domination always brings. It reveals power when power tries to hide itself under claims of objectivity, of clarity, or impartiality. Whenever a system claims that it is doing a very questionable practice out of necessity, power is lurking beneath it. Whenever an institution tries so hard to legitimize credentials under the guise of being able to know who is reliable, in reality the institution is putting up its ideological watchdogs. Credentials and diplomas are more oaths to the ideology of the state than to impartiality and expertise. And so that's why philosophy stands in opposition to the cult of credentials. I don't care how many diplomas you have or how many PhDs, if you use what you know for the sake of ideology, then your credentials are worth nothing for the philosopher. And so this, of course, is a challenge for philosophers, because in society where those who are heard are those who simply put forth their credentials, in order to challenge them, philosophy would also need to present its credential first, which actually means that it has defeated itself. That is why philosophy's goal isn't to suggest alternatives to the society of credentials, since to be able to give alternatives requires that it has credentials. As they say, it acknowledges no abstract norms or goals which could be a practical alternative to those in force. Instead, philosophy does something else. All of these attempts at sedating the individual to the nature of power. The institutions, universities, churches, newspapers are all working in unison for the spread of ideology and to maintain people under its spell. Philosophy is to refuse to be under anyone's and any ideology's spell, and Adorno and Horkheimer, who lived through the fascist regimes of the 30s and 40s and through the world wars, they argue that the task of the philosopher is to expose the lies of power. Refusing to be hypnotized by the preponderant power, it pursues it into all its hiding places in the social machinery, which by its nature cannot be taken by storm or placed under a different control, but must be understood in freedom from the spell which it casts. So waking people from the spell of ideology doesn't, however, mean that philosophy is against PhDs or the division of labor or even bourgeois ideals. Like we said many times, the point of this book isn't to reject enlightenment, but to save it. The exposure of power isn't to get rid of universities or newspapers, but rather bring in their own dialectical dimension, which they are ignoring. And Enlightenment destroyed itself because it was blind to its own dialectical process. Like the dialectic of enlightenment is enlightenment being blind to the dialectics. It claimed to emancipate people from myth, but myth stands in a dialectical relationship with enlightenment. So enlightenment needs to acknowledge its dialectical counterpart and recognize that it too has its own benefits. Progress and the division of labor must recognize their dialectical counterpart. When philosophy does criticism, it reveals that the dialectical part of the relation has been forgotten. And as they write about philosophy, it believes that the division of labor exists for the sake of human beings and that progress leads to freedom. That is why it is liable to come into conflict both with the division of labor and with progress. It gives voice to the contradiction between belief and reality, paying close attention to phenomena conditioned by the time. Like we said about mourning in the theory of ghosts, when we talked about isolation, it is in dialectical relationship with the market, meaning that it stands against the market. It marks its own sacred space in which the market cannot invade. So philosophy gives a voice to mourning by its criticism of the market. Now, of course, in the religion of progress, the destruction of whatever philosophy gives a voice to is justified on the grounds that it is insignificant with regard to progress. Who cares about a few days of mourning when you can use those days to produce so much wealth that's 1,000 times more than what the deceased person was worth all their life, right? But philosophy doesn't give a shit about grandiosity. As the authors point, if philosophers write the newspaper or broadcast the news, they won't give more importance to a mass murder than to the death of a few inmates in an asylum. They won't say that a compromise made with a fascist leader is more newsworthy than a local lynching of an innocent man. They won't cover the box office success of a film when there is the announcement of a random guy's funeral. So the grandiose means nothing to philosophy. Whenever it sees it, it is concerned with the voices that are not heard, and it makes them loud by criticizing the grandiose, by revealing its contradictions, because it is the contradictions of the grandiose that are silenced voices. The myths silence in the grandiosity of enlightenment, because they were silent for too long, they turned enlightenment against itself. Therefore, by making those myths vocal, enlightenment could have avoided all the calamities that it brought in its wake. So, the future of enlightenment wasn't certain for Adorno and Horkheimer, but they hope that with philosophy, its project will be a real force against fascism than to turn into it again. And as they conclude this entry, they say, the taste of the grandiose is foreign to it, thus to it its philosophy. Thus it is at the same time remote from the existing order and deeply complicit with it. It lends its voice to its subject against the latter's will. It is the voice of the contradiction which otherwise would not be heard, but would triumph silently. And so this leads us to the last fragment about the role of philosophy, to give voice to the contradictions we don't notice. And the next and last fragment is called Contradictions. So people are often confused about the role of philosophers. Like, what do philosophers actually do? What is expected of them? And to use the words of Adorno and Horkheimer, what we expect from philosophers is often a moral system with axioms, corollaries, and iron logic and reliable application to every moral dilemma. So what we expect of them, that they would provide some sort of system that would help us solve moral dilemmas. We face dilemmas all the time in our life. We all have to make difficult choices that would have consequences on others. And so the classic case is when people have to choose between family or a career, for example, or it's when you know something about a friend that can badly affect another, but this other friend has the right to know, and so you don't know what you should do exactly. Should you tell them or not? Like, whatever you do, you seem to pay a certain cost, and so you don't know what is the right thing to do. In such cases, we expect philosophers to help us. They will provide axioms, that is, fundamental principles in morality, like the Kantian, don't treat people as means, but always as ends. Or, corollaries, that is, a proposition that by necessity follows from another proposition. Like, if I show you that the benefits of choosing your family outweighs the benefits of choosing your career, then the corollary in this situation is that choosing your family is the right thing to do. And lastly, philosophers are supposed to bring in iron logic, meaning flawless logic, which makes the moral system total and can be applicable with perfect reliance to every moral situation. In short, we want philosophers to bring us a manual for doing the right thing. But according to Horkheimer, well, philosophers did that. They fulfilled that expectation. But as you can guess, there's a catch. According to them, philosophers who provided these moral systems simply justify the already existing praxis. In other words, people simply want an authority to tell them not what is the right thing to do, but to tell them that what they already did was the right thing to do. Like, philosophers provide ways to rationalize our actions when we are not feeling too good about ourselves, or when we just don't want to know why we did it. So choosing one's family or one's career over the other relies on a praxis or on some social organization, a certain ideology that prioritizes one over the other. But one can ask why, and this why is troubling for the authority that wishes to maintain that praxis. And so it calls in philosophers to provide the justifications for why things must be done the way that they are done. Usually they have justified once again the whole scale of values already sanctioned by public praxis with all the comforts of sophisticated reasoning, demonstration, and evidence. So it's like when people do questionable things, but because they heard a philosopher give a sophisticated reasoning in favor of that action, they feel like that action is justified. They have evidence backing them up, and so they are comforted in their own insecurities. When Epicurus, for example, tells us to honor the gods through the traditional native religion, you suddenly feel confident that your belief is safe from questioning. That's, the example they give in the note. If Epicurus or Hegel said it, if such intelligent men said it, then my belief is justified. No further whys are needed. And even when philosophers don't reaffirm the prevailing values and praxis, they need to bring to bring in an even greater generalization. They must appeal to universals, to concepts and rules more abstract than the rules of the praxis, that they end up bringing an even bigger authority to impose them. Quote, if thought does not simply reaffirm the prevailing rules, it must appear yet more self-asserted, universal and authoritative than if it had merely justified what was already in force. This is when you end up justifying concepts that are so abstract and broad that they are just obvious. Have you ever had this kind of conversation where you start criticizing something specific, like a certain rule, for being maybe unrealistically rigid or irrelevant, and then someone blames you for being against rules in general? Like, they frame it as if you are against something that is, obvious, as if you are against the very concept itself, whereas you are just criticizing an oppressive application of it. And so Adorno and Horkheimer give some examples. When you criticize a certain organization of power for being too rigid and oppressed, a philosopher will start arguing in favor of order itself and blame you for being absurd. That if you criticize this specific power, then you are against power in general, or so, and so you are for chaos, Or when people criticize progress and they are turned to ridicule as if they said that what they said is, let's go back to lighting our rooms with wax candles like they did in the Middle Ages. Or when vegetarians say that it's wrong to eat meat, they are told that they are being unreasonable because they are against food. Or that if you are against, slaughterhouses, then you want everyone to eat raw vegetables, like, not even cooked. So they also provide a detailed example of this conversation between two persons, a person A and a person B, and it's about doctors. It opens with person A asking person B why they don't want to be a doctor. And person B is like, well, because being a doctor desensitizes you because, you are constantly working with dead people. And he also adds how the institution managing medicine turns doctors into a representation of business and a hierarchy with the patient, like the doctor, instead of being a doctor, becomes an oppressor, an authority over the patient. Doctors, because they depend on the pharmaceutical business, see the patients as customers. But unlike regular customers who want to buy a car, when it comes to doctors, what we want to buy is life, or at least buy not death. Which means that we are in a more alarming state when we are, the customer of a doctor, and this gives the doctor a big power over us. And we are not sure that letting such power to industries and institutions is such a good idea. Like B says, if one is selling automobiles, it's not so bad, but if the commodity being administered is life and the customer and the consumers are the sick, it's a situation I'd prefer not to be in. But of course, A interprets this as person B doesn't want anyone to be a doctor, like there shouldn't be doctors anymore, and will be like either the doctors or the old charlatans, which isn't at all what, and we will be like either the doctors or the old charlatans, which isn't at all what B is saying. What B is saying is something more precise than we don't need doctors at all, or asking if we need doctors at all. That would be completely unreasonable. What he says is, I am not against reason, I only want to investigate the form it has taken. So he gives the example of judges and prosecutors. He says that they are in a position in which they have an authority over the criminals, which can lead the judges into being worse than criminals. But also, if we remove judges and prosecutors and give free arms to robbers, then we would have a worse situation than the one we would have with judges and prosecutors. The problem is just how those figures, the judges, are operating within a given system that gives them too much power, so much so that all of their sentences are overproportionate. But A doesn't seem to understand. A then accuses B of being in contradiction with himself. The contradiction is that B is criticizing doctor and prosecutors, but he benefits from what doctors and judges produce. It's like he's saying these people are doing something bad. What he's getting advantage of their actions. So the idea is that if you criticize someone's actions, you should also avoid any benefits from those actions. Otherwise, you are as guilty as they are. You are complicit in their crime, and therefore, unless you leave the world created by doctors and judges, you cannot complain. But wouldn't that be convenient? Like, person A doesn't deny that he's getting advantages from person B isn't denying that he's getting advantages from doctors and lawyers. What he's saying is that everything in society is modeled on this. Everything in society is produced like a crime, so that everyone feels guilty and therefore has no legitimacy in criticism. The result is we either leave, which only if you can anyways, or we remain silent about the injustices produced by the system. So having a process of production based on the division of labor comes off as a ruse by the system to be immune to all criticism. If people leave the system, then they lose their right to criticize. And if they stay, well, they also lose it as well. Hence, B chooses to stay for two reasons. First, and this is more like, something that can happen as consequence of his true goal, there is a chance that by criticizing the system, people will become aware of this paradoxical situation and start making changes. And second, this is his true goal, he says, that is not the reason why I want to be a writer, I just want to be clearer about the terrible state in which everything is. So for B, the contradiction that A raises is necessary, since all of society is in contradiction with itself. So B isn't the exception. He's not making a contradiction as opposed to the rest of the population who remains silent. He wants to write about that contradiction. He wants to make it more visible and explain its origins. But A again sees this as nonsense. He understands B's position as no one must get their hands dirty. He takes B to be an idealist that thinks that we can create a society in which no one would do something he's not proud of or isn't happy about. And of course, A takes his acceptance of the status quo as realism. When people people be like, I'm not an asshole, I'm a realist. Well, A is the asshole here. For him, the fact that we have blood on our hands means that we are in accordance with reality. Any idea that questions this must be childish. Idealist, in this sense, we often, in the sense we often use, not in the philosophical sense, is someone who dreams of better societies, but he is not in the real world. It's children who dream of such fantasies, worlds where they can have it all, where they don't have to make difficult choices. Whereas people like A, they are mature. They are about making sacrifices and shit. And so with people who are willing to get their hands dirty, he says there will be neither without people who cannot make have dirt on their hands. He says that there will be neither doctors nor judges. And so what kind of world would that be? For A, this would be a world that B wouldn't accept to live in, even for a day. So B must shut the fuck up. Checkmate. But A is stuck in a false dilemma. For B, there isn't either doctors and hands dirty, or no doctors and everyone dies. He says, humanity has other possibilities. I am not the whole of humanity, and I cannot simply represent it in my thought. Now, this is the interesting part. As he acknowledges that humanity has other possibilities, he also says that it's not B's job to provide the alternatives, to say what are those other possibilities. It is rather the job of humanity as a whole. What A is lacking is the courage to not have an authority laying down on him some system that will guide him in his existence. No one can provide that system, whether with dirty hands or without. It is rather the task of humanity as a whole to find out what other possibilities there is. But in order to do that, it must leave its state of tutelage, like Kant said about enlightenment. To be enlightened for Kant means to be independent and autonomous, which is precisely what humanity should be. Humanity shouldn't expect from one individual to tell them what to do, but find it for itself. There are no maxims that people can provide to justify their actions that are universal and would be, case closed. My actions aren't even my actions, but the result of a long dialectical process. In my actions, there is a whole history that dates way before my birth. So what B says next makes sense. If someone doesn't want to do something, A takes that as if that person prefers a world where no one does the thing. It's like A is the one trying to derive maxims out of B's words and actions. B doesn't want to be a doctor, then he must obey the maxim, no one should be a doctor. But as B asks, why should my disinclination to be a doctor be equivalent to the view that there should be no doctor? In what way B's critique is a call for the disappearance of doctors. He even says that if doctors manage to do their profession within moral limits, like if they manage to help without the influence of the industry or ideology, then B would admire them. He even points that if they are capable of doing that, they'll make him less inclined to the criticism he's been making about being a doctor. But he doesn't have to be a doctor in order to help people. He can do it indirectly by writing about what he finds wrong about the current state of affairs. To this, Aid responds with that it is still better to be a doctor than a writer because the knowledge he'll get from medicine will allow him to help his loved ones when they get sick, whereas the knowledge of being a writer won't cure diseases. So A asks B if he knew that his beloved ones will be sick, won't he choose to become a doctor? And B responds with this: probably, but by now you can see for yourself that with your love of implacable logic, you are forced to offer the most absurd examples, while I, with my impractical obstinacy and my contradictions, have remained within the bounds of common sense. So the meaning of this is that the logic of A, which technically is true, that it is better to become a doctor because of the risk of your loved ones would face a disease, but despite being true, it leads to the absurdity that one must also become a judge. I mean, why just, stop at the risk of disease? Why not also, the risk of a car accident? Shouldn't B also become an engineer and make sure that his loved ones' cars are fully functional when they go for a ride? How about the risk that your house falls on you? Shouldn't B also become an architect? And so this is what the logic of A leads to, the absurdity that one individual ends up having to become everything instead of himself. He must live by just one system that pushes him into modeling all aspects, absolutely every single aspect of his existence into one direction. By thinking in absolute practicality, person A gets a world in which nothing can be practical actually, while person B, by preferring something diverse from pure practicality, becoming a writer, has more common sense than the logician. But for the others, the logic of people like person A attracts a lot of listeners because attracts a lot of listeners because of its abstract and general nature. Being this broad and abstract, it is easily marketable. They write political anarchism, the revolutionary arts and crafts movement, radical vegetarianism, eccentric sects and parties have advertising appeal. The doctrine need only be general, self-assured, universal and imperative. So what is appealing about such doctrines is that they comfort people more than concrete praxis. They take them out of the frustration of the either-or because it simply dissolves all contradictions. When the either-or is between power and chaos, between progress or the Black Plague, between the slaughterhouse or the salvation, the choice is easy. And as such, people don't have to worry about the the consequences anymore. If progress leads to Auschwitz, it is better than the Black Plague. If people give the feeling that all difficult cases are closed, to mistrust a general concept is unbearable for people because it leads them to the constant frustration and anxiety that life is not that simple, that things are never a clear cut, that morality and ethics cannot be a matter of just applying blindly principles and axioms like mathematics. People, as the authors say, find it impossible to endure loyalty without a doctrine, because without a doctrine we become responsible for our actions. When we know that there is no preconceived concepts that will, comfort us in what you do or don't do, it means that now you have to take responsibility, you have to make a choice. So for Adorno and Horkheimer, philosophy's main goal is to do the opposite of this. Philosophy is thought, and for thought to be thought, it must resist praxis. When thought surrounds to praxis, it loses the freedom of its essence. Anyone who gives up on thought for praxis, or imposes on thought to serve praxis, like making, thought's sole purpose praxis, is someone who has given up on freedom. They want to be cogs in a machine that runs smoothly, where all of their actions become automated. But a person who resists praxis doesn't allow for logic to be overwhelmingly ubiquitous. Like, he doesn't surrender all aspects of life to logic. Even when the machine says that the life of one person is less valuable than 5, the philosopher should resist such logic, which explains why the philosopher is often a neurotic by the standards of the author's time and also ours. It's the neurotic because the neurotic lives the contradictions, because the neurotic lives, the contradictions of his society. Person B, the philosopher, recognizes contradictions, while person A cannot stand contradictions. A contradiction for person A means a blind spot, an area that his system cannot process. And so the only way person A can deal with contradictions is either by silencing them or by casting them away. And so the only way for enlightenment, to be saved, is precisely by that, by admitting the contradictions, and by seeing that it cannot, provide a system that would explain everything. And so the point of philosophy is precisely displaying that, conveying that, the impossibility of totalizing, and so to always be aware that there is some dialectics, that there is always, a contradiction that is at play, and we must pay attention to it. And that's why, all of philosophy has to be, fragments. It cannot be a system, a totalizing system, and it's okay if you find contradictions in it. And that's why this book has been subtitled Philosophical Fragments. And so now we have finished everything. We went through the whole book. It's been a long journey, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I know that some of you did. I read your comments, and so I really want to thank you for that. Thank you for the support, and hopefully more things are coming. More greater things are coming, and I will see you next week for the announcement of a new book that we are going to read. And so be prepared for the next journey. And as always, thank you for watching, and